The cold was merciless. It crept through the walls of makeshift barracks, slithered into thin shoes, and gnawed at bone until sleep itself became a kind of shivering. For women who had been torn from their homes in occupied Asia and transported into the custody of a foreign army, winter was not a season, it was a punishment. They had been told to expect cruelty, to brace for humiliation. And when the Americans handed them thin wool blankets, the gesture seemed almost mocking. The fabric was light, almost laughably so, compared to the heavy quilts they had once known. Many scoffed, wrapping themselves half-heartedly, convinced that such feeble cloth could never shield them from the night's teeth. But as the weeks passed, they discovered something unexpected. Layered, shared, pressed together in close quarters, those blankets held heat like a secret. In that fragile warmth, cynicism cracked. What had seemed an empty token became a lifeline, and in that lifeline lay a lesson no propaganda could erase. If you are drawn into stories like these, fragments of war not written in textbooks but carried in breath and memory, stay with us. Share this journey with those who search for the human pulse inside history. And if you wish to walk with us through these shadows and revelations, subscribe so that more of these untold voices can find their place in the light. The train screeched against the rails as it slowed, sending sparks into the night. For hours, it had thundered through a landscape of skeletal trees and frozen marshland, each mile dragging the women farther from what little they still recognized as home. They pressed against the wooden walls of the carriage, their breath a thin fog in the frigid air. Some clutched small bundles of clothes, others nothing at all. They had been rounded up quickly, some pulled from villages in Korea or the Philippines, others seized from brothels and hospitals as the front collapsed. All were herded under the same label: women once used, now discarded, now prisoners. Outside, a wind howled low, carrying with it the metallic tang of snow. The station lights flickered weakly, casting pale halos across the drifts. As the doors of the train slid open, the cold poured in like water, slapping faces already drawn tight by hunger. A soldier barked a command in English, sharp but not cruel. The women hesitated, glancing at one another, then shuffled toward the opening, their thin shoes slipping on ice crusted across the steps. The night smelled of coal smoke, diesel, and a faint sweetness they couldn't place. They were led from the platform into waiting trucks, the kind used for supplies and soldiers, not for prisoners. No one explained where they were being taken. In the dim light of the truck bed, the women huddled close, their shoulders touching, their hands tucked beneath armpits to save warmth. One of them muttered that the Americans wanted to parade them, to shame them, to grind them into the snow. Another whispered that perhaps they would be shot and left in a ditch before sunrise. The words rose and fell like small waves of despair. The convoy rolled through the darkness for what felt like hours. Frost coated the windows, turning the world beyond into a blurred painting of white streaks and black branches. Occasionally, a guard's voice rose in laughter from the cab. The women flinched at the sound, uncertain whether it carried malice or simply indifference. Their last days under Japanese control had taught them that any laugh could signal violence. Trust had long been stripped from them. When the trucks finally stopped, the women were ushered out into a compound ringed with wire. Beyond the fences loomed low wooden buildings, their roofs hunched beneath snow. A sign hung crookedly near the gate, its English letters unreadable to most of them. The guards gestured them toward a barrack, its door yawning open like a dark mouth. Inside, rows of bunks lined the walls, a small stove squatting in the center, its iron belly cold. The women moved hesitantly, as though stepping into a trap. The barrack smelled faintly of damp wood and old soap. Thin mattresses lay on the bunks, covered with coarse sheets. It was not home, but neither was it the dungeon they had imagined. Still, exhaustion did not soften their suspicion. They curled into corners, arms wrapped around knees, waiting for the inevitable blow. Hours passed. No blow came. Instead, a young soldier entered carrying a bucket of water and a stack of small tin cups. He set them down and retreated without a word. The women stared at the water as though it might vanish. Finally, one reached out, dipped her hands, and sipped. It was cold but clean. She closed her eyes and swallowed, and for a moment the tremor in her hands eased. Night fell fully. The stove was lit, its weak heat radiating outward. But it was not enough to fight the wind sneaking through the walls. The women lay shivering on the bunks, their teeth clicking, their breath rising in faint clouds. Every creak of the floorboards made them flinch. Some prayed silently, clutching rosaries or folded cloth charms. Others stared into the dark, their minds drifting back to faces they might never see again. The first gesture of American mercy, the blankets, had not yet arrived. Only the cold surrounded them, heavy and unrelenting. They felt it in their bones, in their lungs, in the spaces between thoughts. Here, at the edge of war's ruin, the night itself seemed like an enemy. And as they drifted into fitful sleep, they could not know that the thin fabric soon to be placed in their arms would become more than a blanket. It would become a quiet test of everything they still believed about their captors, their enemies, and themselves. The blankets arrived in the morning, carried in stacks by soldiers whose boots left sharp prints in the snow. The women sat upright on their bunks as the guards distributed the cloth, each bundle folded neatly, each one identical. At first glance, the gifts seemed like a mockery. The fabric was thin, its weave loose, its weight laughable against the knives of winter. A few women snorted under their breath, bitter smiles twisting across their chapped lips. These were not blankets. They were insults stitched from wool. One by one, the women accepted them anyway, because refusal was not an option. They turned the cloth over in their hands, testing its lightness, rubbing it between their fingers as if trying to uncover the hidden cruelty within it. Some pressed the blankets to their faces, half expecting the fibers to reek of chemicals or disease. Others spread them across the bunks without a word, staring at the fabric as though it might burst into flames the moment they looked away. That night, when the stove's fire dwindled to faint embers, the first test came. The wind howled across the compound, rattling shutters, sending icy fingers crawling across the floorboards. The women lay curled tightly, each wrapped in her new blanket. At first the cold gnawed as before, sinking through skin and into bone, but as the hours passed, a strange thing happened. Where bodies pressed together, where blankets overlapped, heat gathered. It was not enough to banish the chill entirely, but it blunted the edge of the night. Slowly, sleep came without the violent shivers of the night before. In the morning, frost still clung to the windows, but the women rose with less stiffness in their limbs. No one admitted it aloud, but the blankets had worked. Just enough to keep breath from turning to ice, just enough to soften the merciless dark. They exchanged glances across the barracks, small flickers of surprise passing between them. The scoffing that had filled the room yesterday gave way to a quiet unease. Perhaps these meager gifts were not empty gestures after all. Still, doubt lingered stubbornly. Some insisted it was a trick, a slow kind of cruelty, to give comfort only to snatch it away later, to remind them of warmth so that its absence would hurt all the more. Others argued that the blankets were calculated propaganda, tools meant to bend them into obedience. Gratitude, they warned, was dangerous. Gratitude made prisoners pliable. In the hushed hours of the evening, arguments simmered beneath whispers, suspicion battling against the undeniable truth of warmer sleep. The guards offered no explanation. They brought food in the afternoons, bread, watery stew, sometimes a piece of fruit, and left just as quickly. Their indifference was unnerving. If the blankets were a trick, why had they not gloated? If kindness was strategy, why was it not spoken aloud? Silence itself became a riddle, and the women twisted it over in their minds until it frayed. As days bled into weeks, the blankets grew softer from use. Some women stitched them together with scraps of thread, creating larger covers to share. Others traded them, 2 for 1, layering themselves in a cocoon of thin fabric that proved stronger when multiplied. The barracks became a patchwork of survival, warmth passed hand to hand like contraband. The same women who had scoffed the loudest found themselves tucking the wool tightly under their chins at night, silently conceding its worth. Yet with warmth came an unfamiliar ache. To be cared for, even in this simplest of ways, unsettled them more than neglect ever had. It forced questions they did not want to face. If the Americans truly wished them harm, why give them blankets at all? Why allow them to sleep through the night without frostbite clawing their fingers? Each layer of fabric felt like an assault on the certainty they had carried into captivity. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the stove glowed faintly and the guards' footsteps echoed outside, some women pressed their faces into the blankets and breathed in their scent. It was faint, wool, dust, a trace of smoke. Not the scent of home, but not the stench of cruelty either. That small detail unsettled them most of all. The blankets were no longer simply cloth. They were contradictions woven into wool, carrying the unbearable weight of both doubt and comfort. And as winter deepened, those contradictions would only grow sharper. What began as thin fabric, scoffed at and mistrusted, was slowly transforming into something harder to dismiss. A lifeline. A quiet mercy that whispered a question they were not ready to answer. Could the enemy be more human than they had ever been allowed to believe? Winter tightened its grip. The sky seemed to freeze into a sheet of iron, and snow fell so heavily some mornings that the barracks' doors stuck fast, forcing the women to shove them open with stiff shoulders. Their breath smoked in clouds as they lined up for roll call, boots crunching in the brittle crust of frost. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, but the deeper torment was the cold, always the cold, creeping into joints, coiling around ribs, settling into marrow. It was in those merciless weeks that the true lesson of the blankets revealed itself. At first, each woman clung to her own piece of wool as if it were a shield, curling inward on her bunk to trap what little heat she could. But survival has a way of dissolving pride. Soon, blankets were spread across shoulders in pairs, stitched together with strips of torn clothing, or draped like makeshift tents between bunks. They learned to layer them, to pin them against the wind that seeped through cracks in the walls. Thin as they were, when multiplied, the blankets transformed into something formidable. In the evenings, after rations had been handed out and the stove fed its last handful of coal, the women huddled close. They wrapped themselves in overlapping cloth, sharing body heat as much as wool. It was awkward at first. Strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, hands brushing in the dark, but necessity stripped away hesitation. Warmth was not an individual possession, but a communal act. To survive the night, they had to share, and in that fragile exchange, something long buried stirred, a faint sense of solidarity, of belonging to one another again. There were nights when the cold still seeped through, when shivers rippled like waves across the room. Yet even then, it was different than the first night in the barracks. They had discovered a rhythm, a method, a way of folding and layering that made the impossible just bearable enough. Some even whispered jokes in the dark, marveling at how cloth once mocked as worthless had become their armor against despair. The transformation was not only physical. With each night survived, trust inched forward, hesitant, fragile, but undeniable. The blankets forced them into proximity, into conversation, into recognition of each other's humanity beyond the labels the war had forced upon them. Women from different villages, different languages, even different corners of the empire now shared the same patchwork of wool. In that mingling of breaths and shivers, they became less alone. Still, doubt was never fully banished. Some clung stubbornly to suspicion, whispering that the Americans intended to soften them, to trick them into gratitude. "They will remind us of this later," one woman hissed. they will use it to claim they saved us. Yet even she tucked her blanket carefully under her chin before drifting into uneasy sleep. Suspicion and survival could coexist, but survival always won. One evening, as snow hammered the roofs, a woman from the southern islands pressed her hand against the blanket wrapped around her and murmured that it reminded her of home, not in its thickness, for nothing could match the quilts of her village, but in the way it carried warmth when shared. Her words spread softly through the room, translated across tongues, a strange comfort moving like a ripple through the barracks. The blanket was no longer just foreign cloth. It had been claimed, reshaped, given meaning by those who depended on it. Outside, the guards patrolled with rifles slung across their backs, their boots crunching through ice. Inside, women slept beneath thin wool that had become something greater than its fabric. The irony was inescapable. What had been scoffed at, dismissed as useless, had proven stronger than despair. The blankets had not only protected their bodies, but unsettled their certainty about their captors. Could cruelty and mercy really live in the same hands? Could the enemy give them back a piece of dignity, even if unintentionally? Each night, as the barracks settled into silence, the blankets whispered their own quiet lesson. Survival did not always come in the form of grand rescues or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it arrived as thin cloth, underestimated and overlooked, gathering strength in numbers, reminding women who had lost everything that even in captivity, warmth could be found, and humanity could still flicker in the dark. By the time the deepest winter passed, the blankets were no longer novelties. They had become part of daily ritual, folded at dawn, spread again at dusk, woven into the rhythm of survival. But as the women's bodies adjusted to the meager steadiness of camp life, their minds turned restless. It was not only food or warmth that gnawed at them now, but the contradictions surrounding every gesture of care. The Americans kept to their routines: morning roll call, rations at noon, patrols at night. Their faces revealed little, eyes hidden beneath helmets, expressions guarded. And yet, small fissures of humanity slipped through. A soldier who quietly set an extra piece of bread on the corner of the table. Another who hummed a tune while lighting the stove, the melody foreign but strangely soothing. Once, during a snowstorm, a guard left his post for a moment to drape an abandoned coat over the shoulders of a woman trembling in line. These were not orders, they were impulses, and they unsettled the women more than cruelty ever could. For cruelty they had expected. They had braced themselves for it, steeled their hearts against it. Cruelty would have confirmed what they had been told all along, that the enemy was a beast in uniform, waiting to break them. But what were they to do with kindness? Every warm act was like a stone thrown through the stained glass of their certainty, letting in light they did not know how to face. Some resisted it fiercely. At night, when whispers filled the barracks, women argued. "Do not be fooled," one would insist. "Every gesture is calculated." Another would counter, "Then why give us anything at all? Why waste blankets, bread, coats on us if hatred is all they feel?" The debates circled endlessly, never resolved, carving divisions even within their fragile solidarity. Gratitude was dangerous, suspicion was safer. Yet the memory of warm nights and softened hunger pulled at them like an undertow. The contradictions grew sharper during illness. A few women fell sick, coughing violently, fevers burning hot beneath their thin skin. They were certain they would be left to die quietly in the corner, as they might have been under their former overseers. But instead, medics arrived. American hands pressed cool cloths against foreheads, measured pulses, offered bitter medicine spoon by spoon. The women stared at their caregivers with suspicion, even as their bodies eased beneath the treatment. To be healed by the enemy was to lose the last defense of hatred. It was mercy masquerading as betrayal. And then there were the radios. At first, the women ignored them, the English words meaningless noise, but the melodies seeped through the fences regardless. Jazz rhythms, swing tunes, voices that rose with joy instead of grief. They carried an unbearable irony. The music of the enemy had laughter in it, while the songs of their own homeland were stillborn with sorrow. Listening in secret, some women swayed almost imperceptibly, caught off guard by the rhythm. They stopped themselves quickly, ashamed, as though joy itself was a crime in captivity. In the quiet hours, the blankets became symbols of these contradictions. They were both gifts and accusations, comforts and reminders. Each time a woman wrapped herself in one, she felt the sting of irony. Why had the enemy given her dignity when her own leaders had stripped it away? Why had thin wool carried more mercy than the empire's promises? The questions festered, refusing to dissolve. By spring, the snow melted, and with it came new routines. Work details outside the barracks, glimpses of green shoots pushing through thawed soil. Life stirred again, tentative and trembling. But inside the women, the turmoil deepened. They were no longer certain of who they were, what loyalties remained, or how to reconcile the kindness of those who had been painted as monsters. It was easier to live with cruelty. Mercy required memory, and memory was unbearable. And so, the contradiction settled like another kind of blanket, one that could not be folded or put away. It covered everything, every gesture, every silence. The women carried it with them day after day, uncertain whether it was a comfort or a curse. What they knew for certain was that captivity was no longer only about surviving the cold. It was about surviving the strange, disorienting revelation that humanity could come from the hands they had been taught to hate. The war ended, but memory did not. Long after the gates opened, after the fences were left to rust and the soldiers packed their trucks, the women carried the blankets with them. Some folded them tightly into bundles and tucked them into bags when they were released. Others tore strips from them to line shoes, to bind wounds, to make small parcels for their children when they finally returned to villages hollowed by war. A few left them behind, unable to bear the shame of keeping a token from captivity. Yet even those women remembered the feel of the wool against their skin, thin and scratchy, but warm enough to keep death at bay. Returning home was not the relief they had dreamed of during the long nights of shivering. For many, home had become rubble. Roofs were gone, fields burned, families scattered. Mothers who had survived the war greeted daughters with wary eyes, as if unsure who exactly had come back to them. Husbands, when they appeared at all, sometimes turned away, their silence heavier than any guard's order. The women wrapped themselves in the same thin blankets on these journeys back, clutching the cloth as though it might explain the contradictions they could not voice aloud. Years passed, and the blankets frayed. Their edges grew ragged, their color dulled, their threads loosened by washing and wear. Yet they lived on in memory with a clarity sharper than most faces or names. The women remembered how they had first laughed at them, sneered at their weakness, only to discover that weakness could sometimes hide strength. They remembered the nights when 2 or 3 huddled together, sharing heat beneath overlapping layers, listening to one another's breathing as reassurance that dawn would come. They remembered how the blankets had become not just coverings, but bridges, between despair and endurance, between strangers who became companions, between the past they mourned and the uncertain future waiting beyond the wire. Some spoke of them later in hushed voices, when memory became less dangerous to share. They would describe how absurdly thin they were, how they seemed like nothing at all, and then fall silent, eyes distant, remembering the warmth that had kept them alive. For others, the story remained locked away, sealed by shame. To admit that the enemy had given them comfort felt like betrayal, even decades after the war had ended. Better to say nothing than to confess that kindness had come from the hands they were told to fear. But memory has a way of seeping through, like smoke through cracks. The blankets haunted their dreams, not the wool itself, but the contradictions woven into it. They symbolized the impossible irony of survival, that sometimes it was the enemy, not the ally, who offered dignity. They carried the bitter truth that propaganda could collapse not only in grand defeats, but in something as small as a piece of cloth draped across shivering shoulders. In their old age, some women passed the blankets on as keepsakes. Children and grandchildren who unfolded them saw nothing extraordinary, just worn fabric, thin and unremarkable. But the women's eyes lingered on those frayed edges, seeing what no one else could: the cold nights, the whispered arguments, the hesitant laughter in the dark, the survival that came not from steel or strength, but from fragile wool. For the women who lived through it, the blankets remained more than objects. They were symbols of war's cruelest irony, that humanity could flicker even where it was least expected. They proved that survival often depended on contradictions, weakness becoming strength, captivity holding small mercies, enemies providing the warmth that friends and nations had failed to give. The memory of cloth became a memory of life itself, fragile and enduring, carrying the weight of shame and gratitude, suspicion and relief, cruelty and care. And in the silence of their later years, when words failed and history swept their stories aside, the women still remembered the touch of wool against skin on a freezing night, the unlikely warmth it gave, and the unsettling truth it carried, that sometimes the thinnest blanket could shield not just the body, but the very last fragments of dignity left to the human soul.